Moscow skyscrapers under attack by Ukrainian drones.
They're just devils. People are sleeping there after work with their families, with their kids.
Muscovites are shaking in their boots.
God knows it's really scary out on the street.
These are missiles hitting.
Moscow's air defense is hitting residential buildings. The governor is furious.
That house over there got hit in the corner, and now smoke is coming out. Is it on fire or what? I can't tell.
Whether you go or not, you can't escape fate.
Bryansk region, missile danger. If possible, go down to the basement or move to a room without windows.
100%, they'll get what they deserve in life for sure.
Said it. Russian orgy lightning friends and boom BA. Yeah, boom. A series of explosions in Russia.
That house over there got hit in the corner. Now smoke is coming out. Is it on fire or what? I can't tell.
Like, comment, subscribe. And we're starting.
Look, it hit the apartment. Can you believe it? Can you imagine? A direct hit. Yeah.
And numerous drones and missiles launched an assault on the dark land of Mordor.
And the reef caught fire! Grandpa, did you say grandma?
Was found. Alright, we'll do it.
Drones attacked Rostov-on-Don. Russian electronic warfare damaged residential buildings. Yeah.
Guys, it's awesome to go on recon just to see what's going on there, what's really happening. It just seems like everyone is already trying to make some kind of deal, just a bunch of jerks. There are people sleeping there after work, families, children. 100% they'll get what's coming to them in life for sure. These are really rotten actions. That's not how people act, only animals do that.
And now attention. This statement was indeed said by a Russian individual, so it turns out he is, for all of us, a significant figure.
It is most likely that a fragment still dropped down.
A shell hit the apartment. Can you imagine?
The oil transshipment point Kavkazskaya in Krasnodar Krai is on fire. Glory to the armed forces of Ukraine in the Russian Federation.
We had just pulled out, just started leaving the area. And then something hit us like that as, I don't know, they called a lot of ambulances. Basically, they took the guys away, I don't know. Alive, not alive, I have no idea, basically.
Russian air defense, while shooting down drones, is hitting apartment buildings. Skyscrapers are exploding. These are serious strikes. Muscovites are in a panic. But most importantly, President Zelensky has announced strikes on Russian territory up to 3,000 kilometers deep. And now, it's happening. Pulkovo, Domodedovo, Sheremetyevo, Plankovo, Ukrainian missiles and our Ukrainian drones are flying toward Moscow, St. Petersburg, and the Moscow and Leningrad regions. Friends, on the night of December 8th, Russia turned into a map covered with fires and explosions. The Moscow region is on fire. There's Kashira, the city administration building has gone up in flames. Hundreds of people were evacuated, but the reasons are being kept secret. Krasnoyarsk, a series of powerful explosions near the thermal power plant. Fuel tanks are burning. The flames can be seen for kilometers. Rostov region, villages left without power and damaged power lines after attacks by Ukrainian drones.
Here he is, the son of a bitch, the faggot!
Engels, another attack on a long-range aviation airfield and an oil depot.
Quiet? Not really.
No.
No?
Ryazan. 2 strikes at once on the largest oil refinery. Where do the fierce drones go? Angast. Accident at the thermal power plant. 1,500 houses are left without power. In the cold, at -19, the door blows out from an explosion at the Reserve oil depot. The Russian aerospace forces are reporting heavy losses, and when the bombers' ejection systems are triggered, pilots and navigators are dying. We'll discuss all this with a well-known military analyst. Roman Svitanov, Roman Grigorievich, welcome.
Thank you, Jafin. Greetings from the road to
A small town near Moscow. Explosions, a fire at the Kashira administration. There, the administration building caught fire and thousands were evacuated. The reasons are being concealed. There's panic. What do you think? Is this an attack, arson, sabotage, or just someone who cares?
well, definitely someone who cares. In any case, someone who cares. The question is, what do they care about? Either about the boss's secretary or about the war against Ukraine. But nevertheless, this is important for us. The act itself as such. Yes, it's definitely about putting pressure on the Russian occupation administration, practically the Moscow one, I would say, the Moscow occupation administration, which everywhere except Moscow, the metropolis, it is purely an occupation administration. Because almost all the lands outside the Moscow ring, outside the ring, are basically colonies. Naturally, resistance to these occupation authorities at various levels, whether military or civilian, there's no point in distinguishing between them. Whether military or civilian, they are subject to destruction. The sooner this happens, the better, especially for us. So a big thank you to all those who care at every level, who are bringing a victory closer, who are hastening the collapse and self-dissolution of the Russian Empire.
Friends, please like this video and in the comments, share your opinion about Ukraine's strikes on Russia. Explosions at CHP-1 in Krasnoyarsk. Amazing footage. There were 2 explosions there, a massive fire at the fuel depots with a huge area ablaze. Roman Grigorievich, why have Russia's energy facilities become so vulnerable at this point? And could this lead to a systemic collapse of the power grid in Russia?
They have always been vulnerable. The fact is, the Russian Federation covers 17 million square kilometers, part of which, especially beyond the Urals and in the north, is exposed to quite severe temperature challenges. In other words, the frost there really reached dozens of degrees below zero. Almost everything there depends on heat and energy supply systems of various levels. That is either gas supply, which would require destruction in order to stop the gas, and there destruction is necessary. The Yamal Cross, we've talked about it before. There are 17 gas pipelines running through it. Now they're also trying to reroute the Power of Siberia pipeline to the Chinese through Mongolia because they're planning to lay another pipeline from there as well. Naturally, the energy sector combined heat and power plants, so-called thermal power stations, which generate both heat and electricity, simultaneously supplying, for example, certain areas. Krasnoyarsk is very important to us. We didn't joke about it, but at the very least, as a target indicator, we showed exactly where to cut the Trans-Siberian Railway so that Chinese and North Korean weaponry wouldn't reach our theater of military operations. Specifically in Krasnoyarsk. We've talked about this with you several times. There are the Sayano-Shushenskaya Dam and the NC there. A little further upstream. Sayano-Shushenskaya is upstream, Krasnoyarskaya is downstream. So if you blow up these 2 hydroelectric power stations, Krasnoyarsk would simply be washed away by water along with the Trans-Siberian Railway. And they would never again in their lives. These 2 parts of Russia would simply never be connected again. That is, the Trans-Siberian Railway is what mainly connects them. That's why this action is important, of course, among other things. But I think our concerned people will get there. The Kazakhs will help because the Sayano-Shushenskaya is right there after all. Right next to Kazakhstan, they'll help to carve up Russia, at least in the Krasnoyarsk region. And now, most likely, there are also some concerned people from the same crowd, by the way, who are either infatuated with the boss's secretary or genuinely care about Ukraine, care about their own land, by the way. Why does Krasnoyarsk need Moscow? So for what reason? How do the people of Krasnoyarsk support Moscow? Why do they need it? Naturally, they need to break away. They understand this perfectly well, and not just in Krasnoyarsk, but all across Russia. They understand it perfectly, Moscow. At this point, they absolutely don't need it, especially in the world that's coming. The 3rd millennium, the age of technology, the age of connections, that is, Moscow as a metropolis is absolutely unnecessary. And if you were to stop, say, the power generation that supplies it, since any thermal power plant, any CHP plant at the very least serves as balancing capacity that keeps the grid stable, for example, preventing rolling blackouts. That's why, of course, it's important to subtract them. And now this trend has started, especially when it's freezing cold. Roman Nikolaevich?
Rostov region, a strike on the power lines. Major population centers, villages without electricity, damaged lines, damaged houses, mass outages. This is now a deliberate strategy of striking supply infrastructure. In general, what effect does cutting power to regions have on the front, for example? And
the Rostov direction is a railway hub. Naturally, rail transport runs on electric traction, so to stop it, you have to take it down. That is either the power lines or the substations or the so-called traction substations on the railway. That's why it's important, of course, to work on these directions. They're working on it, and especially since it's only 150 to 180 kilometers to Rostov. Basically, it's what you'd call fly as much as you want. And our guys have already paved the way there. NATO has trampled the path too. And Taganrog, it's the same direction. Taganrog Rostov is well covered by various strike systems. It starts with operational drones, so-called, and our partners are supplying us with a lot of them right now. And ending with missiles, even if not the statistical ones. Like we talked about Flamingo in the summer, talked about Flamindi. Everyone heard about flamingos, but you can't see or hear them. And the ballistic missiles have gone completely quiet. So as soon as Flamindi slipped away to Israel together with Zuckerberg, or rather, Zuckerman, well, it doesn't matter. So as soon as they slipped away to Israel, we forgot about all those missiles, but nevertheless, there are still means of attack. At least we have access to operational level ones now. Naturally, within this operational combat radius, somewhere around 150 to 180 kilometers, all military targets will be hit there in a certain sequence.
Engels, the attack on the Kristall airfield fuel depot. Let's separate these two topics. Let's start with the long-range aviation base location. What are the consequences, Roman Igorovich? And in general, how many times have we already struck Engels in the past 6 months? The floor is yours.
Well, about 7 times already. Well, not in 6 months, in a year. So it's already quite a serious direction there. To be honest, I wouldn't separate them. And here's why. Because the so-called base you're talking about is actually the storage facility for aviation lubricants and materials at Engels Airfield. Why call it a base? Because, for example, a single Tu-160 aircraft consumes 3 railroad tank cars of aviation kerosene. Can you imagine what kind of bases they have there? So basically, it's just a storage facility, essentially a fuel and lubricants depot. For example, at a tactical aviation airfield, it's 5 times smaller, and really it's just a small warehouse with pumps that perform specific tasks. And here it's also a fuel and lubricants depot, but it's a much more serious oil storage facility where hundreds of thousands of tons of fuel are stored, which then supply the needs of this particular Russian long-range aviation airfield. Moreover, now part of the tactical aviation, the Su-34 and Su-35 are also based there. It's important to remember that in this direction, first of all, Saratov is basically a single city. Saratov and Engels are separated by the Volga River. Saratov is on the right, there's an oil refinery there. On the left, along the eastern bank of the Volga, that's where Engels is. Along with this, there are fuel and lubricants, a fuel depot, and of course the Engels airfield. But under Engels, there are very large karst caves, which the Russians, well, back in the Soviet era, converted into aviation kerosene storage facilities. That is, under Engels, there are hundreds of thousands of tons of aviation kerosene stored in special caisson tanks. Nevertheless, it is possible to get there. Now, there are almost up to a dozen of them. The strikes in this direction are essentially attempts to find the entry gates, so to speak. This is precisely the underground fuel storage facility. If they find it and there's an explosion there, it'll be quite a spectacle. A nuclear bomb wouldn't even come close. The Volga will definitely not burst into the Caspian, but into the Aral Sea. It will flow a bit further east. That will help the Kazakhs, and not just the Kazakhs. It will benefit Central Asia, that's one thing. And secondly, well, we'll forget about the residents there for good, since that's how things are.
Roman Igorovich, we understand that fuel supplies have been hit, and that really complicates airstrikes. But what about the airplanes? Is there any information that, for example, in the recent period, we have actually struck strategic aviation?
The issue of fuel supply is a global one and should be addressed as such. Why have we talked so many times on our broadcasts about the need to strike first and foremost at oil refineries that produce aviation kerosene? By the way, the Ryazan refinery is exactly that kind. Saratov does not produce aviation kerosene. So there are about a dozen plants that produce aviation kerosene on an industrial scale, and they definitely need to be taken out. If we take out these oil refineries, then basically Russian aviation will be grounded, that's for sure. Of course, a single strike on this base is unlikely to ground Russian aviation entirely. It won't completely reduce the number of aircraft and plant sorties. So here, a serious and painstaking effort is needed to destroy the entire Russian sector of aviation kerosene production. We know which plants produce it, and we have the ability to reach them as soon as we have enough strike assets. I think those plants will be taken out soon enough. Well, at this stage, of course, in order to reduce the number after a missile strike, we need to target Russian aircraft, which is exactly what we're doing. Operation Web, remember, was aimed precisely at reducing the number of these aircraft. I think an operation of this kind takes a long time to prepare. I think our special services will also please us by destroying these aircraft. But realistically, of course, until we learn to intercept them at long range, that is at least as far as the Caspian, which is very far away. So for us, for now, it doesn't exist.
Roman Nikolaevich, Ryazan, a strike on the oil refinery, the third strike on the refinery this month, as analysts have written. Military personnel, there were explosions near the city. So, accordingly, why has the Ryazan oil refinery now become a systematic target, and what are the consequences for Moscow if, for example, we systematically destroy the Ryazan refinery? This
is precisely based on our initial speech that we really need to target the petroleum refining infrastructure that manufactures jet fuel for the Russian Federation. Moreover, Ryazan is among the top 5. The Ryazan oil refinery is one of the 5 largest refineries in Russia, processing over 15 million tons of oil per year. Plus, Ryazan is located on one of the technological corridors. Remember, we talked about how to completely shut down Moscow. There are 8 technological corridors. So Ryazan is one of those technological corridors, which, in addition to electricity, are loaded up. There are power lines there carrying 500 to 750 kilowatts. There are power transmission lines, and the Ryazan refinery is practically pumping light petroleum products through pipelines, diesel, gasoline, aviation kerosene, all going to the Moscow region. So it's an entire process that definitely needs to be stopped. One of the options is to destroy the refinery itself. Although there are still other things there that can be targeted, for example, the same product pumping stations or any stations that pump petroleum products.
Roman Nikolaevich, and of course, this is what everyone is talking about. Tver explosion at the Rosreserve oil depot damaged storage tanks, likely an attack. Again, Rosreserve facilities catch fire, I don't know, twice a week, I read about it. And then Angarsk, an accident at CHP 9, 1,500 homes without heat at minus 19 degrees. Again, this doesn't leave anyone indifferent either. And let's discuss both the Rosreserve oil depot in Tver and the one in Angarsk. Blackout accident at CHP 9.
Why are those who care so valuable to us? In general, this is a resistance movement within Russia. Because in principle, with just a match, a simple match, you can set a major Russian facility on fire. The same goes for the state reserve base. Of course, the optimal scenario, especially for those who know what needs to be set on fire, is that a single match is enough for the whole base to burn down. There are certain technological aspects, especially those related to pumping in, transferring, cleaning, or, for example, shutting down some processes. And if you know those in particular, then in principle, you could burn down at least half of Russia. And of course, Angarsk, that's right by Lake Baikal. It's on the western, well, you could say the western side of Baikal. So right now, there are some serious frost there, already down to minus 20 degrees. And those who care are actually finishing off Russian thermal power generation, especially in that direction. The flow, by the way, the transfer of electricity from the east of Russia to the west to the center of Russia is actually quite well established for them. This whole system operates along the west-east axis, basically following the sun. Naturally, the peak electricity consumption involves transferring electricity from the eastern to the western regions, with balancing capacities such as thermal power plants also participating in this process. That's why it definitely makes sense, especially when the overall goal is to bring down the Russian energy sector to destroy these balancing capacities. Again, it's like with that same matchstick. Basically, specialists know exactly what needs to be set on fire for it to burn down completely.
Roman Nikolaevich, Russia is negotiating with India about drone production. An attempt to localize the Lancet in India in exchange for labor migrants. That's how the news sounds. What does this indicate? Technological exhaustion of Russia? What does possible Indian assembly mean for the war?
It means that the Russians are trying to hide the Israeli product in India as well. What is the Lancet? It's the Israeli Hero 400 EC. The Israelis built it more than a decade ago. A factory in Russia for producing four-posts. Heavy drones, both reconnaissance and strike types, including those capable of carrying aerial bombs and missiles, have been terrorizing Ukraine for more than a decade. And it's the same story with the Lancet. So the Lancets are the Israeli Hero 400 EC, which were produced in Russia, and now they are trying to draw India into this so-called axis of evil for the production of military equipment as well. Trump behaved, to put it mildly, inappropriately and practically pushed India away from the democratic path of development. He threw it into the arms of Xi Jinping, China, and Russia, although in principle, India was doing quite well without them. So this is Trump's problem. And naturally, Russia immediately seized upon cheap Indian labor, so-called the workforce that could be used for drone production. The Lancet is a decent machine. The Israeli Heron 400C is definitely a well-designed system, meaning its aerodynamic layout, control system, and range. Now, it's not just 40. There are already models with a 70-kilometer range. Now, the Indians will be producing this for the Russians, and naturally, there will be this Israeli-Indian-Russian friendship. I would put it this way. It will be used to kill Ukrainians.
Friends, please like this video and write a few kind words in the comments to support Ukraine's armed forces. Together with the well-known military analyst Roman Svetin, we are on my YouTube channel 3 times a week. Roman Grigorievich, thank you, and as usual, see you this Wednesday. Thank you very much.
Goodbye. The issue of fuel supply is a fundamental one and should be addressed globally. That's why we've talked about this so many times in our broadcasts, about the fact that the first priority should be to strike oil refineries that produce aviation kerosene. By the way, the Ryazan refinery is exactly that kind, while Saratov does not produce aviation kerosene. So there are about a dozen plants that produce aviation kerosene on an industrial scale, and they definitely need to be taken out of operation. If we take out these oil refineries, then basically Russian aviation will definitely be crippled. Of course, a single strike on this base, it's unlikely to ground Russian aviation completely or reduce the planned number of sorties. So what's needed here is a serious, painstaking effort to destroy the entire Russian sector specifically involved in the production of aviation kerosene. We know which plants produce it, and there is a way to reach them. But as soon as there are enough strike assets available, I think those plants will be taken out. Well, at this stage, of course, in order to reduce, after a missile strike, we need to get to the Russian aircraft themselves, which is basically what we're doing. Operation Web, remember, was aimed precisely at reducing the number of these aircraft. I think an operation like this takes a long time to prepare. I believe our special services will still please us by destroying these aircraft, but realistically, of course, until we learn to intercept them at long range. That is, at least as far as the Caspian, which is very far away. So for us, this doesn't exist yet.
Roman Nikolaevich, Ryazan, the strike on the oil refinery, the third strike on the refinery this month, as analysts have written. The military, there were explosions near the city. So accordingly, why has the Ryazan oil refinery now become a systematic target? And what are the consequences for Moscow if, for example, we systematically destroy the Ryazan refinery? This
is precisely what we were discussing in our initial speech, meaning that it is absolutely essential for us to target the oil refineries that are responsible for producing aviation kerosene. Moreover, Ryazan is among the top 5. The Ryazan oil refinery is one of the 5 largest refineries in Russia, processing more than 15 million tons of oil per year. Plus, Ryazan is located on one of the technological corridors. Remember, we talked about what it would take to completely shut down Moscow. 8 technological corridors. So Ryazan is one of the technological corridors that are being loaded up. In addition to electricity, there are power lines there carrying 500 to 750 kilowatts, transmission lines, and the Ryazan refinery is practically pumping light petroleum products through pipelines. Diesel, gasoline, aviation kerosene to the Moscow region. So, in other words, this is a whole process that definitely needs to be stopped. One of the options is to destroy the refinery itself. Although there are still some other things there that can be reached, for example, the same product pumping stations or any stations that pump petroleum products.
Roman Nikolaevich, and of course, this is what everyone is talking about. Tver, explosion at the Rosreserve oil depot, damaged storage tanks, likely an attack. Again, Rosreserve facilities catch fire. I don't know, twice a week. I read about it. And then Angarsk, an accident at CHP9, 1,500 homes without heat at -19 degrees. Again, this doesn't leave anyone indifferent either. And let's discuss both the Rosreserve oil depot in Tver and the Angels blackout, the accident at CHP-9.
What makes those who care valuable to us? In general, this is a resistance movement within Russia. Because in principle, with just a match, a simple match, you can set a major Russian facility on fire. The same Rosreserve depot. Well, of course, the optimal scenario, especially for those who know what needs to be set on fire, is that a single match is enough for the whole depot to burn down. There are certain technological aspects, especially those related to pumping in, transferring, cleaning, or, say, shutting down some processes. And if you know those in particular, then in principle, you could burn down at least half of Russia. And of course, Angarsk, that's right by Lake Baikal. It's on the western, well, you could say the western side of Baikal. Right now, it's really cold there. Temperatures are already down to -20 or so. And those who care are actually finishing off the Russian thermal power industry, especially in that direction. The flow, by the way, the transfer of electricity from the east of Russia to the west, to the center of Russia, is actually quite well established for them. This whole system operates precisely along the west-east axis. That is, the peak electricity consumption practically follows the sun. And during this peak load, electricity is transferred from the eastern to the western regions, with balancing capacities such as thermal power plants also participating. That's why it definitely makes sense, especially when the overall goal is to take down the Russian energy sector to destroy these balancing capacities. This is arson from the same match. Basically, specialists know exactly what to set on fire so that it burns down completely.
Roman Nikolaevich, Russia is negotiating with India about drone production. An attempt to localize the Lancet in India in exchange for labor migrants. That's how the news sounds. What is this a sign of? Technological exhaustion of Russia? What does possible Indian assembly mean for the war?
It means that the Russians are trying to hide the Israeli product in India as well. What is the Lancet? It's the Israeli Heron 400 EC. The Israelis built it more than a decade ago. A factory in Russia for producing four-posts. These are heavy drones, both reconnaissance and strike types. They can carry both aerial bombs and missiles on board. And they've been terrorizing Ukraine for more than a decade already. And it's the same story with the Lancet. That is, the Lancet is the Israeli Hero 400 EC, which it was produced in Russia. And now they are trying to draw India into the so-called axis of evil for the production of equipment, including military equipment. Trump behaved, to put it mildly, inappropriately. He practically pushed India away from the democratic path of development and threw it into the arms of Xi Jinping, China, and Russia, even though, in principle, India was doing quite well without them. So this is Trump's problem. And naturally, Russia immediately took advantage of cheap Indian labor, so-called the workforce that can be used for drone production. The Lancet is a decent machine like the Israeli Hero 400 EC. Definitely well built in terms of aerodynamic design, control system, and range. Now, it's not just 40. There are already models with a range of 70 kilometers. Now, the Indians will be manufacturing these. For the Russians, of course, this will be an Israeli-Indian-Russian friendship, so to speak, that will be used to kill Ukrainians.
Friends, please like this video and write a few kind words in the comments to support Ukraine's armed forces. Together with the well-known military analyst Roman Svetin, we appear 3 times a week on my YouTube channel. Roman Grigorievich, thank you, and as usual, see you this Wednesday. Thank you very much.
Goodbye.